think we have already a large number of people connected, so we will start. That's okay for you, Mélanie and Samuel? Yeah?
That's good.
Okay. So first of all, welcome everybody to this new IRSEM webinar, and thank you for being so many to join us today for this particularly timely event on the Afghan crisis seen from Russia and Central Asian countries. I said timely on purpose because not later than today, Moscow hosted the first Afghan talks held since the Taliban takeover last August. And I'm certain that the groundbreaking expertise of our today's two panelists, Mélanie Sadozai and Samuel Ramani, will help us to decipher what was at stake today in Moscow, and more generally, what are the perception of the ongoing events in Afghanistan seen from Russia and Central Asia, and which policies those countries have so far implemented and intend to follow in the context opened by the regime change in Kabul. Before starting, I'd just like to remind that IRSEM is hosting a second event tomorrow on Afghanistan, chaired by Ms. Aurélie Biard, and which will feature Gilles Doron-Soro and Adam Basco, who will both present their latest books about the transnational government in Afghanistan and the Taliban courts of Afghanistan. You're of course more than welcome to this event, and for those who cannot attend it, there will be a video recording soon available on the IRSEM YouTube channel. Let us now briefly introduce our two speakers. Mélanie, it's a great pleasure to have you today on the other side of the screen, not as a co-chair, but as a panelist. You're a PhD student at INALCO, a visiting fellow at the GW Sigur Center, and an associate at the Central Asian Program. And you're currently completing your PhD dissertation on the southern border of the Tajik Pamir. By the way, we all know that finishing a PhD is rather time-consuming. So thank you for having found time to be with us today. Thanks a lot. Over the past few years, you conducted several fieldworks at the border between Afghanistan and Tajikistan. And last summer, you witnessed from the Tajik territory the Taliban takeover. You recently gave several talks on current events at this border at George Washington University, the French Institute for Central Asian Studies in Bishkek, IFEAC, and for the Majlis podcast hosted by Radio Free Europe and presented by Bruce Pally. Among your recent publications, I bring to the attention of the attendees an article published a few months ago in the Journal of Borderland Studies called The Tajikistani-Afghan Border in Gorno-Badakhshan, Resources of a War-Torn Neighborhood, which represents a key contribution to the field of border studies and which I highly recommend to anyone working on Central Asia. Finally, I bring to the attention of the audience an article to be published soon by the Central Asian Program on the relation between Tajikistan and Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover last August. I now give the floor to my colleague Maud to introduce Samuel.
It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I have the great pleasure to co-host this seminar and to introduce Samuel Ramani. Sam, welcome. It's the first time that you're taking part in the IRSEM seminar, so we're very lucky to have you at IRSEM for this event this afternoon. I have to remind our audience that you are an associate fellow at the Royal United Service Institute in London. You're a tutor of politics and international relations at the University of Oxford. And as we mentioned earlier, you recently defended and received your doctorate in March 2021. So congratulations again. You're specializing in Russian foreign policy. You're a frequent and prolific contributor to a wide range of media publications, such as Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, and Almonia. Let me mention as well that you had you gave a recent interview in early September of the acting president Amrullah Saleh for Newsweek. So all the links will be available as well to follow your different activities and papers. And beyond Russian foreign policy in the Middle East and Afghanistan, you also published recently many articles on Russia in Africa, another timely topic, obviously, including a fascinating article for the Foreign Policy Research Institute on Russia's role in the Horn of Africa, which I highly recommend. So let me mention here the release in June 2022 by Heureux, publisher of your first book, about Russian policy toward Africa, which may for sure be of great interest for Russia's watchers attending today's event. So before giving you the floor, I'd like just to kindly remind our kind audience that because of the large number of attendees today, we ask you during the Q&A session to send directly your questions to the Q&A box, and Emmanuel and I will regroup and read them, of course, to Mélanie and you, Samuel. So as usual, you can also, if you want, to introduce yourself while sending your question. Now it's time for presentations and then Q&A. So Sam, the floor is yours. And again, thank you for being with us this afternoon.
All right. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's really honor and a pleasure to be here to be discussing such a timely and important topic. So today I'm going to discuss Russia's policy towards Afghanistan, and I'm going to be providing a bit of a longer historical view of why Russia is doing what it's doing with regards to engaging with the Taliban but not recognizing the new Islamic Emirate and some of the facets associated with that, while also providing a blueprint as to how Russia's policy towards Afghanistan might progress moving forward. Obviously, it's hard to make long-term predictions, but we can certainly get a sense of where things might be able to go within the next 6 to 12 months, and what lessons from the past might tell us about the present and near future. So that seems to be what I'm going to be focusing on today. And I have prepared some slides here, which I can kindly share with the audience. Okay, it's not for whatever reason it's not working, but anyways, we can kind of just get going on the presentation and just keep moving. So yeah, okay. So first of all, I think it would be useful to discuss the current events that are just happening. So today there was the first Russia-hosted conference on Afghanistan that featured Hanafi, who was the deputy prime minister from the Taliban, and also was a key figure who was working with the European Union and the United States in prior dialogue, alongside representatives from a variety of non-Western countries. So the 5 Central Asian countries plus China plus Iran. The United States was initially expected to join, but then it did not. And this is the latest incarnation of the Moscow format talks, which Russia has been hosting on Afghanistan, engaging both a variety of local Afghan actors and non-Western powers ever since 2017. So this is the latest incarnation of that. And that's the context for today's events. And it signifies, I think, Russia's continued commitment to playing a role in Afghanistan's political future and in engaging and creating a multilateral consensus on the way forward on issues relating to counterterrorism, narco-trafficking, as well as security in Central Asia. So it may not produce any major results. I mean, Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Peskov, all were initially saying that there's going to be no movement towards recognition of the Taliban or no concrete or comprehensive breakthroughs, to take the words of Putin's press secretary. But, the slides are up now. But the next slide would be good, yeah. But they definitely will symbolize and encapsulate the fact that Russia has an important role to play in Afghanistan's future and will be a major stakeholder going forward. So why is Russia playing such an important role in Afghanistan at this present moment in time? And what is Russia's current policies really, where do they come from? Like, are they just something that's an adaptation to the events of August 15th and their aftermath, or have they been in motion for a long time? And as you can see from my first slide over here with the historical background, there's a lot of long-term antecedents to Russia's policy, both being skeptical of the Taliban, as they've been holding drills in Central Asia, and being pretty measured to even pessimistic in some of their rhetoric, as we've seen from some officials, while at the same token willing to engage with them and see value in engaging them diplomatically, in the hopes of either moderating their conduct or building trust or steering them in a more productive direction. So that mixture of diplomatic engagement and containment is something that has been in the works for about 15 years in terms of policy. So in terms of a brief historical background of Russian policy towards Afghanistan after the end of the Soviet war, Russia obviously viewed Afghanistan as a clear and present danger to its own security and to that of its southern flank, especially in the context of Chechen separatism. So Russia became one of the leading international supporters and try to build a coalition, which was orchestrated by figures like Yevgeny Primakov, then foreign minister, as well as Vyacheslav Trubnikov, who eventually later became ambassador to India, in building a coalition in support of the Northern Alliance and against the Taliban. The Taliban informally recognized the separatist Republic of Chechnya and allegedly provided and funneled military support back and forth to them. And as a result, was designated as a terrorist group by Russia in 2003. So that whole period in the late 1990s into the early 2000s, Russia was one of the most hawkish countries, if not the most hawkish country in the world, towards the Taliban before the September 11th attacks. And that extended towards cooperation with the United States after 9/11. So whether that be the Northern Distribution Network transit corridor that allowed for the movement of war material, as well as vital resupplies and economic goods, whether it be Russia's uncharacteristic tolerance for American engagement with Central Asian countries on security issues, which included the establishment of the Manas base in Kyrgyzstan, and also Russian drills that occurred with the United States on issues, particularly narco trafficking, that heated up during the first term of the Obama administration, 2009, 2010. So there was a lot of cooperation with the West. There was a general feeling that the Taliban were an unabashed and hardline enemy and terrorist group, and that was the prevailing trend in policy. By 2007, however, the beginnings of the current Russian policy towards Afghanistan, seeing the value of engagement with the Taliban, began to surface. And that surfaced due to a variety of factors. First of all, the Russians were really convinced that the United States, or at least in their narratives, were saying that the United States was not doing enough to deal with the threat of narco trafficking. And it was a popular saying in Russia that the aftermath of the movement of narcotics from Afghanistan to Central Asia and Russia during the 1990s killed more Russians than the Soviet war in Afghanistan did in terms of loss of life and in terms of destruction of the country's human capital and potential. So that was a major exigent threat. And whether it be the fact that they just wanted to find an area to criticize the United States, or they were genuinely concerned about the lack of U.S. attention to this issue, Russia established a line of communication with the Taliban in 2007 on the issue of anti-narcotics. It did not appear to have any kind of substantive results. As I said earlier, during the Obama's first term, there were continued U.S.-Russia drills, including joint operations and strikes on narcotics facilities in 2010, 2011. But there was the belief that the Taliban could be something other than an enemy, and even in a very narrow sense, a potential partner, really developed over here. Obviously, the systemic context is also important to keep in note. I mean, the aftermath of the Iraq War, the color revolutions, the Putin's Munich speech, the general deterioration of Russia-West cooperation into a state of heightened contestation, and then by 2014, this outright systemic confrontation over Ukraine, and the general belief that U.S. military interventions, particularly those of a unilateral and protracted character that were aimed at nation building and democracy promotion, were either destabilizing or completely ineffective. And Russia's engagement with the Taliban was a symbolic display of opposition. Again, this was mostly symbolism, but it was a paradigm shift in thinking that carried on later on. Since 2015, however, we have seen Russia continue to designate the Taliban as a terrorist group and continue to provide active military support to Tajikistan, as well as periodically engage in talks with Kyrgyzstan about a second base, which don't really come to fruition, but it just still shows that they're concerned about security spillovers and deterrence. Combine deterrence with diplomacy. And there's a real concerted move towards constructive engagement with the Taliban that coincides with the U.S. sanctions on the drug czar, Viktor Ivanov, in 2014, which revived dialogue in the narco trafficking sphere. And then in 2015, the collapse of the Northern Distribution Network, which really brought Russia-U.S. cooperation on Afghanistan to a complete dead stop. That's where you start seeing a return and resurgence and revival of Russian engagement with the Taliban. And it was revealed by Putin's envoy to Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov, at the end of 2015, that Russia and the Taliban were now exchanging coordinates or exchanging intelligence on defeating the Islamic State, because the Islamic State was a threat and an enemy to both Russia and the Taliban. Russia also began amplifying the Taliban by holding talks with it, even without the presence of Ashraf Ghani or legitimate members of the Afghan government. Those were the Moscow format talks, which I will discuss a little later in this presentation. And those are the talks that provided the contextual foundation for the events that we saw today with regards to Russia hosting talks in Afghanistan. But there was a general belief that the Taliban, if engaged with sufficiently, could become a potential trustworthy bulwark inside the Afghan government. Keep in mind, the Russians were not thinking about an outright takeover of Kabul, but they were thinking of some kind of agreement where the Taliban shared power with the Afghan government. And Oleg Barabanov, who was a key figure in the Valdai Discussion Club and an expert on Russian foreign policy, said that it would be possible for Russian diplomacy to create a trustworthy Taliban. And it was in this context that Russia allegedly supplied arms to the Taliban, as John Nicholson stated in March of 2018. And when I visited Moscow in 2017 and 2018 and discussed these arms transfers, they were met with a mixture of vociferous and vigorous denials and whataboutism accusations that the United States was supporting ISIS in Afghanistan on the hardline end, but also some more moderate and liberal intellectuals and policymakers that I did speak to were willing to admit, at least off the record, that Russia was providing small amounts of arms to Afghanistan as a trust-building measure, as a confidence-boosting measure to strengthen cooperation in the event of a Taliban power-sharing agreement with the Afghan government. So it's clear to see that the Russians have not viewed the Taliban now as an unabashed enemy, but are engaging with them in a constructive fashion and have been working on building confidence-building measures with them for at least 6 years, as well as providing a superficial overlay of dialogue for about 15 years. And that's the context for today's developments. So this is the longest slide, and then I'll go through some other stuff more succinctly. So let's go on to the next one. So this is the Russian reaction to the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the events of August 15 and its immediate aftermath. So in the month leading up to the Taliban takeover, you noticed quite a clear discursive shift in Russian official reactions to the events on the ground. You started seeing, in particular, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov decrying the hastiness of the American withdrawal, the lack of a game plan that would come after, and decrying both the long-term results of the February 2020 Doha Agreement as well as the Biden administration's specific policies. And this was a notable contrast because the Russians had in the years prior, as I said, viewed Afghanistan as yet another one of these failed nation-building missions or long-term military interventions that were producing no outcome. So, for example, when Trump announced his South Asia strategy in August of 2017, you had figures like Alexei Pushkov calling the United States a loser superpower and saying that this extension was going to be doomed to failure or was just aimed at consolidating American control over mineral resources in Afghanistan and over key infrastructure facilities in Central Asia. So it was either hegemonic, extractive, and it was doomed to failure. Then that narrative suddenly shifted, the U.S. is withdrawing too soon and the U.S. doesn't have a game plan. And that, I think, reflected all along an undercurrent of discourse within Russia, which was also apparent from my interviews. Now, while the Russians would criticize the American presence publicly, they were happy to see the Americans on the front lines fighting the Taliban and dealing with the security situation, so they didn't have to deal with it themselves. So there was a mixture of criticism, but also free riding that was at play here. And as a result, this cacophony, this mixture of anti-Western voices who were hardline against the U.S. intervention, and the pessimistic voices in the security establishment who saw the U.S. as keeping the lid on a potential firestorm, that was explained some of the divergent reactions we saw after August 15th. So optimistic voices would be like Ambassador Dmitry Zhurnov, who talked immediately about mineral investments, who talked immediately about how the Taliban had made Kabul much safer overnight, basically. Or Putin's envoy Zamir Kabulov, who was also an important conduit in their engagement with Pakistan. These figures were willing to embrace and support the new regime. Dmitry Zhurnov was even willing to be the only foreign ambassador to accept the invitation from the Taliban to attend their inauguration ceremony on 9/11, only to U-turn on that, probably because Sirajudin Haqqani was appointed as interior minister. At least that's the view of the Russian press and some experts I spoke to after that event. The more pessimistic voices really came from the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, like Russia's mutual defense bloc, as well as some members within the security and foreign policy expert communities. The expert community reactions are especially interesting. One was that the Taliban is overly factionalized and cannot be trusted as a partner. Second, Pakistan has compromised Afghan sovereignty with the involvement of the Haqqani network. And third is basically that the Taliban might be keeping more residual links towards extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and even eventually down the line, particularly when they deny that ISIS was even present in Afghanistan. That caused alarm bells in Russia. So those were the three reasons and sources of pessimism as to why And those sources of pessimism are not too different from what Americans and Europeans are talking about. So there's a bit of convergence over there. And now it's a policy of engaging without recognition. So on to the next slide. Just is Afghanistan a threat or an opportunity for Russia? This is an interesting question. I think that Afghanistan is mostly a challenge or a threat from the Russian point of view, but it also presents some opportunities for Russia, particularly to project itself as a global power, to fulfill that notion of Dershavnas, which is so essential to Russia, Russian greatness, Russian great power status. It's so essential to Putin's modern foreign policy vision. So the security of Central Asia is a key priority. The numerous drills that we're seeing at the SCO level, as well as with India, Pakistan, China, all reflect this, as well as their expansion of their military presence in their military base in Tajikistan, which already had 7,000 forces in the 201st base before the war, before the Taliban takeover, sorry. That's a sign that they're viewing it as a threat. They also see economic opportunities in the reconstruction and mineral spheres. So that's important. And they see hope in some of these long-term connectivity projects. So when Suhail Shaheen, basically said that the Taliban were interested in joining TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, that was met very positively in the Russian press as a sign that they're committed to that. Even the Taliban participation in the Belt and Road Initiative, despite of the wariness of the BRI within some in supporters of the Eurasian Economic Union, was also seen as a sign that Afghanistan wanted to enter the existing regional economic architecture and also become a force that was engaged in terms of stability. So in terms of economic integration and in terms of mining assets, there's hope for cooperation. Though China, for example, has the Mezanyak copper mine. They've been working on that since 2008 with no progress. So I think that the connectivity element might present more opportunities than the mining elements. Obviously, there's other areas of cooperation, like Afghanistan has numerous outstanding orders for Russian military technology, MiGs, helicopters, but obviously those arms sales are not going to happen. Russia was supposed to deliver the Sputnik 5 vaccine to Afghanistan, but dragged its feet for 5 months in the winter and spring, and we haven't heard anything about that since the Taliban takeover. So there's other areas too, but probably in terms of connectivity is really where the cooperation is. And the threat dimension is going to be first and foremost, because they will need to secure the southern flank before they can even think about economic opportunities. So now on to the next slide about Russia's participation in inter-Afghan diplomacy. So that provides a context for what I mentioned in the response to the first slide, as well as the very start of this presentation. Russia is going to be a committed and expanded player in terms of inter-Afghan diplomacy. And that reflects what it sees as its striking success in Syria with regards to the sponsorship of the Astana talks and turning the tide of that conflict. It's trying to do that in Libya, it's trying to do that in Central African Republic, it's trying to do that all across really conflict zones in the global south. And Afghanistan is going to be no exception. Though, unlike in Syria, where it's acting as an outright arbiter, I think in Afghanistan it's going to try to act as a hosting place, as a dialogue facilitator, as a neutral location where people of different Afghan factions can come together and engage. And Russia maintains pretty good relations with most Afghan factions. Amrullah Saleh obviously being one exception. I mean, he accused the Russians of having Bronze Age logic after they invaded the Taliban. And when I spoke to him about Russia, he wouldn't comment on it in private, but was not very optimistic. And off the record. And Ahmad Massoud, however, from the National Resistance Front, was more optimistic about it. He was willing even to ask for Russian humanitarian assistance. Gulbuddin Bakhtiar and his son is another figure who's engaged with the Russians. You've seen numerous people from the Afghan High Council of Peace, Hamid Karzai, Abdullah, all engaged with Russia, as well as figures within the Taliban. So Russia has a diverse array of local actors it can engage with, and it can act as a potential facility or location to make the Taliban more inclusive. The number one press comment that came out of this, the talks today that were just released about 15 minutes before this webinar began, were that Russia wants an inclusive Taliban, and that inclusivity is a prerequisite for recognition. So to support that cause of inclusivity, Russia is going to try to promote cross-ethnic engagement and cross-factional engagement and use its location in Moscow as a great power hub to do that. So that's why I see it being, it's more dialogue facilitation and fostering inclusivity rather than outright mediation in the Syrian sense, that will sell the Syrian success to give it credibility in Afghanistan. And there'll be conferences that it will host mostly non-Western powers, and they'll also support and amplify the efforts by other countries. Like Iran is hosting a talk very similar to this, potentially within the next 2 weeks. Uzbekistan has hosted these talks in Tashkent and Samarkand. the Russians will back these non-Western initiatives as part of its broader support for a multipolar world order and its participation in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So now we're getting close to wrapping up. So let's go on to the next slide. And the relationship between Russia and external powers. So I think that the situation in Afghanistan has plenty of opportunities to both strengthen, but also create questions and doubts in Russia's relationships with regional and great powers. I think security cooperation with China will likely expand, though it remains unclear to what extent the Russians will accept China stepping on their toes in their own sphere of influence. When China was trying to do the drills in Badakhshan in 2019, obviously the Russian press was quite critical of that. They tend to see even projects like CPAC and Gwadar as like this kind of, or even the Djibouti base, as far as that, as this kind of never-ending Chinese expansionism and connectivity that could enter their own region. So on the one hand, there's insecurity and almost paranoia about what Chinese expansionism and Chinese involvement in their own neighborhood might be. But on the other hand, they have the SCO and they have joint drills. And what we're starting to see is increased interoperability, which Chinese military technicians and Chinese military officials are accessing Russian equipment, more Russian drills being held on Chinese soil, et cetera. And that cooperation will continue and strengthen their security foundation. Second, with regards to Pakistan, I think that there'll be cooperation. I mean, Imran Khan's and Vladimir Putin's engagement right after the Taliban takeover, which contrasted with Biden's cold shoulder to Imran Khan, was seen as a defining moment in Russia-Pakistan relations, according to one columnist for the Express Tribune in Pakistan. And the coincidental development of the Pak Stream gas pipeline, along with their cooperation, is noteworthy. Though, as I said earlier, Pakistan's risk to Afghan sovereignty in the Haqqani issue is still an elephant in the room that floats over and could restrict cooperation going forward. Third, I think that Russia-Iran cooperation will increase. The Russians have always said Iran deserves a seat at the table. The extended Troika format doesn't include it, but Lavrov wants Iran and India to join. So I see Russia amplifying and ensuring that Iran is not considered an outsider, but is actually an important and constructive player here, at least from their point of view. So that will deepen Russia-Iran cooperation, and it reflects trends that we're seeing in terms of Russian elevation of Iranian diplomatic involvement in Syria, and also in Yemen as well, more proximately and more indirectly. So that's another interesting trend. And fourth is a narrow opportunity for Russia-India cooperation, mainly shepherded by the relationship between their two national security advisors, Ajit Doval and Nikolai Patrushev, but also this talk about India having a role in Central Asia, something that Putin and Modi have discussed. And if TAPI comes to bear fruit, then we could even see more cooperation on connectivity projects. Little prospect of engagement with the West, though obviously dialogue on ISIS might become an important issue down the line. But I also don't think that Russia will be an active spoiler or supplying arms to insurgent groups that will threaten the United States' territory, which was an issue that people in Washington were talking about a lot, especially after the bounty allegations that came forward last summer. So I don't think Russia will be a major spoiler or a major rival to the United States there, but neither will they be a partner. So on to the feature. Here's a few very brief predictions before we pass the baton on to Melanie. The future of Russia's Afghan policy. Well, there's four trends I would like to focus on. The first is engaging without recognition is likely the way forward. The Taliban are not going to be removed from the terror list anytime soon. And I've spoken to Russian officials about why that might be the case. And while they view some Islamist militant groups like Hezbollah and Hamas as non-terrorist organizations because they primarily target an external aggressor, which in that case, from their view, is Israel, in terms of the Taliban, they have disrupted the existing political order within a state, and therefore that's a higher threshold of kind of illicit behavior than just targeting an external actor. And that's why they say that the Taliban will remain on the terror list going forward. So that I don't see changing, and the statements today all confirm that. Second, Russia will continue to use the situation in Afghanistan to bolster its status and hegemony in Central Asia, in particular new arms contracts, maybe that second base in Kyrgyzstan, deeper integration with Tajikistan, maybe finally getting it into the EAEU after 6 years of dragging their feet. In 2015, when I was in Moscow, they said it was going to join by next year, and 5 years later, nothing's happened. Third, we've got cooperation and assertiveness on narco trafficking, but probably outsourcing terrorism to Central Asia and to local actors. And fourth, I think a focus on a remote power projection over direct engagement. The Russians may be rehabilitating the Soviet war in Afghanistan. It's led by the Duma, Franz Klintsevich in particular, as well as Federation Council and the Kremlin, but they don't want a repeat of the events of 79 to 89 ever happening again. So that's why I think it's going to be about remote power projection instead of direct engagement. So I think I provided an overall lay of the land here. and a bit of Central Asia talk, which should be a great segue, hopefully, into Melanie's very, very interesting presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing her now.
Many, many thanks, Sam, for this great and very stimulating and amazing presentation. Now we leave the floor to Mélanie for the next presentation, a perspective seen from actors from the borders and Central Asian actors, right? So Mélanie, okay.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay.
That's perfect, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, for the kind introduction, and thank you so much, Samuel, for your presentation, which was extremely dense, thorough, and I really learned a lot. So I hope I'll be as informative as you. I will divide my presentation into two parts. First, I'll give an overview of the positions on the positions of Central Asian countries on the Afghan crisis, and then I'll focus on Tajikistan, because we see that the case of Tajikistan is really unique in the region, not only in Central Asia but in the larger region. So, on the matter of the Taliban, when it comes down to Central Asia, we see just like on the international scene, we see two groups. Right, so those who are willing to recognize the Taliban and those who are reluctant to recognize them. So that's the international scene. But in Central Asia, it's exactly the same sort of pattern that we see. With the exception that one of those groups is only comprising one leader, the president of Tajikistan, who has been extremely reluctant to recognize the Taliban and who has been showing a harsh position on them. So in the first group, for those who recognize, who are willing to engage with the Taliban, we see Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. You see a map here of Central Asia. So those four countries, the authorities of those four countries have been holding talks with the Taliban publicly. The leaders of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan actually met in Tashkent very recently, and they reinforced their shared position on the need to engage with the Taliban. The president of Turkmenistan even declared that cooperation by Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan in the Afghan direction can only bring great advantage in the business of normalizing the political situation in that country. A Taliban delegation also met with Uzbek officials last weekend, and President Mirziyoyev has called for unfreezing Afghan assets, and the border between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan has also become a conduit for humanitarian aid to reach Afghanistan. We also have Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan providing humanitarian support to Afghanistan, and last weekend a special envoy of the president of Kazakhstan met with the Taliban, and Kazakhstan is actually emphasizing the need for talks and humanitarian aid. Kyrgyzstan also sent a delegation to see the Taliban in late September, and this delegation was actually headed by a senior security official. So we see this first group of four countries engaging with the Taliban, and then we have Tajikistan, which is the only Central Asian state that's not holding talks with the Taliban, and having a very clear position on not engaging with them, even making a case for not recognizing the Taliban if they don't form a multi-ethnic government. You see that Tajikistan is bordering Afghanistan, and it shares the longest border with Afghanistan. I mean, it's the one Central Asian state that shares the longest border, so it's extremely important, and we'll talk about it in the second section. So even though the five Central Asian states do not speak in unison, they do, however, share common concerns, and even Tajikistan. So those concerns are twofold. First, they share economic interests in seeing Afghanistan at peace, and they have security concerns. So regarding economic interests, I really like that Samuel talked about the notion of connectivity, because to me it's extremely important in this Afghan crisis. We must bear in mind that Central Asia, since the 2000s, is more and more connected. and tends to get more and more connected in the future through large-scale regional projects. Last summer, Uzbekistan actually hosted an international conference on connectivity of Central Asia and South Asia. So that's a clear sign of Uzbekistan wanting to be connected with Afghanistan and with South Asia in general. And when it comes down to connectivity for Uzbekistan, the most important sector, one of the most important sectors is electricity, energy provision. It's interesting to see that Uzbekistan hasn't cut off imported electricity to Afghanistan, and Tajikistan has not cut off electricity either, which is more surprising in the case of Tajikistan, of course, because of the rhetoric of Tajikistani officials. But that, in my opinion, shows that there's a relationship of need between Central Asia and Afghanistan when it comes down to exporting electricity and energy in general. There's this one big project that's called KESA 1000, which is actually right now put in jeopardy because of the current situation in Afghanistan. But every single country involved in this project wants to see it flourish. So just because of that, they're gonna need to talk with the Taliban so that this project can flourish, right? And then I mentioned electricity export between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, but that's the case is similar with Tajikistan. And electricity supply between Tajikistan and Afghanistan has actually increased. It has not decreased between 2020 and 2021. So that's interesting to see that Tajikistan here has a leverage because Afghanistan is in debt, needs to pay for this electricity, and Tajikistan at some point can use that as a leverage to try and convince the Taliban to meet their demands, the demands of Tajikistan. Now there's another project that Samuel also mentioned, the pipeline, this huge pipeline project. But the problem now is that those large-scale projects are not able to be fulfilled because the borders are closed. And the closed border regime is a real problem for those projects and also for the local level, for people who live at the border. They cannot benefit from the economic resources that are brought about by the cross-border markets, for instance, along the border with Afghanistan. All the cross-border programs in general are not operating right now. So not only large-scale projects are on hold, but also people-to-people contacts are in jeopardy, and people are not satisfied about the situation. So that's also gonna play a role in trying to solve the situation in Afghanistan. So definitely this is not benefiting anyone. And it's important to have the voices of the local people also heard, because to me, it's going to play a role because civil society is going to have a take in this as well. Now, the borders are closed for security reasons. And that leads me to talking about security interests of Central Asian countries. And those interests, and that's where I meet also Samuel, those interests completely align with Russia's interests. And they are twofold as well. It regards the terrorist issues and the refugee issues, which are actually intertwined. So the victory of the Taliban over the former Afghan government is actually great news for all the radical groups worldwide, right? We've seen some of those terrorist groups in Africa, namely, applauding the victory of the Taliban. That actually gives great signals to terrorist groups in Central Asia and to those Central Asian citizens who belong to any terrorist organizations. It means that an insurgency for them, it means for them that an insurgency can win over foreign force and a government in place. And for Central Asian leaders, that's a reality. They are terrorist groups hosting Central Asian nationals. They exist, they do operate, and they do have undeniable ties with the Taliban. Now, there are also individuals that are not identified, but who are in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, etc., and who are not satisfied with their own governments. And that's seeing what the rise of the Taliban and the takeover is a source of motivation for them to actually to act on their frustration towards their government. Now, the problem is that there's a lack of knowledge on the degree of control that the Taliban have over the groups that are hosting Central Asian nationals and the power of impact that those groups have. We don't know the types of weapons they have. We don't know the relationship they have with the local population. We don't know the branch of the Taliban they're in contact with. So, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and that is creating the threat. One of those groups is the Jamaat Ansarullah, and I will talk about this group in the second section of my presentation. And this group is operating along the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and that's also a major source of threat for Tajikistan and Russia. According to Russia and to Central Asian states, and that leads me to talking about the refugees, the terrorist threat is embodied by a sort of imagined massive influx of refugees that would cross the borders into Central Asia and who could hide some of those terrorists. And that's the reason why the borders are closed. However, terror attacks that took place in Central Asia, namely terror attacks that took place in Tajikistan in 2018, were not claimed by the Taliban at all. They were claimed by ISIS. So ISIS and those historical Central Asian terrorist groups are the main concerns for Central Asian states. And that doesn't mean that, you know, they're not also intertwined. Central Asian nationals who would think that those terror groups like Jamaat Ansarullah are not radical enough, they can join ISIS. And that's what's in the minds of the Central Asian leaders in Russia. So to conclude on this section, there are economic interests, common economic interests, and a common fear in Central Asia. And the same goes for Tajikistan. So all Central Asian leaders have an interest in actually cooperating because they do share common concerns. And it's interesting to notice that Tajikistan's unique position has not been condemned by Central Asian leaders. And they cannot really condemn President Rahmon's position because I think they want to see this cooperation taking place. It's needed so that the security issues are curbed. And cooperation is also needed when it comes down to what's going on at the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, which is closely monitored by Central Asian leaders and by Russia, and which is actually the magnet of the fears that I was mentioning. So that leads me to the second point, the unique case of Tajikistan. Here is a map of Tajikistan, so you see that it's bordering Afghanistan. I apologize because the map is in French, but I'm sure it's not an issue to be able to understand the main information. The border stretches along approximately 1,344 kilometers, approximately, and it's the longest border shared between Afghanistan and a Central Asian state, like I said. So when you look clearly at the border, and I can say that from studying this border and being there when the Taliban took over, the ones who do not want to engage with the other is Tajikistan, because the conditions of engagement have not been met. So the conditions are the main condition is to form a multi-ethnic government, which would include ethnic Tajiks. That has not been met, and that's why Tajikistan does not want to engage with Afghanistan. Whereas the Taliban, Tajikistan does not want to engage with the Taliban, but the Taliban want to be talking with Tajikistan. So clearly there's a sort of a dead end right here, because Tajikistan doesn't want to recognize the Taliban and doesn't want to talk with them. Now, why so? Why Tajikistan is having this position? The president of Tajikistan, Emomali Rahman, is actually the only Central Asian leader who was in power when the Taliban were ruling Afghanistan in the late 90s. So he's actually right now, he's standing by the position he's always had. There's a long history between Rahman and the Massoud family, so namely Massoud's father and son. Last year, Ahmad Massoud, so Ahmad Shah's Masood's son, if that makes sense. Last year, Masood met President Rahman before we could even imagine that the Taliban would take over so quickly. So they are extremely close. Also, the president of Tajikistan is letting Ambassador Afghan, who is the ambassador of Afghanistan in Tajikistan, openly and publicly supporting the NRF, the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, when it could be so easy for Tajikistani authorities to kick him out of the country. So they're giving a voice to the Afghan resistance. And actually last week, there's a member of parliament in Tajikistan who compared what was going on in Afghanistan to the attacks of Genghis Khan. So he was noting that the Taliban took power by force, just like in the Middle Ages. So the position is extremely clear. The position of Tajikistani authorities is extremely clear. We have here a territory and a government which gives a space for the resistance to speak and for in order to condemn the Taliban. This sort of narrative is working well domestically. Civil society is supporting this narrative against the Taliban, and in order to show support for the Tajiks, the ethnic Tajiks of Afghanistan, and it also works well internationally, right? Because it goes along the lines of the position of Western countries. Now the problem is that there's a limit in that rhetoric, and it's to be seen precisely at the border with Afghanistan. So, like I said, there's a common thread of seeing terrorists crossing the border disguised as refugees. But massive crossings at this border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, massive crossings are not a thing because the border right now is shut down, and it has been shut down for a year and a half by the Tajikistani side. And even though Tajikistan officials have declared that they were willing to host Afghan refugees, even up to 100,000, they're not delivering on their statements. Tajikistan acts more as a transit zone for refugees and for Afghans who try to flee, rather than as a place of refuge. Lots of families have been congregating at the border. They've been begging for Tajikistan's help, but they haven't crossed the border en masse. That means like massively, because order has been given to Tajikistani border guards not to let them cross. And the fact that recently the Taliban have moved people by force away from the border on the eastern side of the border. But that's actually recent, because before that, they were not preventing people from crossing. The thing is, like, the border was closed on the Tajikistani side. The Taliban were saying, as long as people have the right documents, they can cross the border. Problem is that most of these people don't have the documents to cross. But so my point is that now the Taliban are preventing Afghans from crossing the border, but Tajikistan has been extremely firm on keeping the border sealed for a year and a half. Why now Tajikistan is not letting Afghans cross the border? Well, like I said, there's this security issue of seeing refugees being actually false refugees and being terrorists. Very recently, the head of national security of Tajikistan, Mr. Yetimov, stressed that approximately 500 to 600 people try to cross the border on a daily basis. I highly doubt that number is accurate. I think it was, for me, this declaration was a way to comfort Russia by proving that there's a security issue at the border. But it doesn't really matter, because what it shows that there's a threat that's identified by Tajikistani authorities, despite the fact that they're compassionate towards ethnic Tajiks in Afghanistan. They're concerned about those Central Asian fighters who might cross the border. What's true in those declarations, including the declaration of Putin, is that there's a clear threat from ISIS and from Central Asian nationals, what I mentioned previously. But for Tajikistan, the problem does not emanate directly from the Taliban. It comes from ISIS and from Central Asian nationals, because they're unpredictable. And because we don't know the degree of control that the Taliban have on those Central Asian nationals, and because we don't know much about ISIS operating in northern Afghanistan at the border. What's important here to understand is that the Tajikistani citizens who are identified as terrorists and who are operating in Afghanistan, they are people who rejected the peace process after the civil war hit Tajikistan and the peace process that took place in 1997. These people they hate the current government in Tajikistan, and the youngest members of those groups are highly radicalized. That is something that we know. So I mentioned Jamaat Ansarullah, which is one of those groups hosting Tajikistani citizens. It's a group that's affiliated with the Taliban and is considered a terrorist organization in Tajikistan. Why are they so dangerous for Tajikistan? It's because they are in charge of border districts. They're in charge of 5 districts in the Badakhshan province of Afghanistan. But as far as I know from being at the border myself, is that they're not literally at the border. They're more confined inland, and they're not all along the border. So the districts that are controlled by Jamaat Ansarullah are more on the western part of the border. So more precisely, there's one individual that Tajikistan is looking at very closely, who is Mohammad Sharifov, who also goes by Mahdi Arsalon, and he's a citizen of Tajikistan. He's in charge of those 5 districts, and reports show that he actually has been traveling to Kabul after the capture of the city by the Taliban, most likely for consultations. So Sharifov is a very extreme person, a very dangerous person for Tajikistan. He holds grievances against the government of Tajikistan because members of his family have been killed by Tajikistani forces. He is extremely radicalized. He tried to radicalize co-citizens in Russia. So he is a clear danger for Tajikistan, and there's no doubt about it. Now, how much he can impact Tajikistan, that's pretty much unknown. We knew he has around 60 people under his direct control. We knew that there are around 200 or 300 people among Jamaat Ansarullah, but we don't know with which faction of the Taliban he's in touch. We don't know the relations he has with the Taliban. We don't know how long he's going to cooperate. So there are a lot of obscure sides that are, sort of creating the threat for Tajikistan. Now, I was mentioning the borderland area. Right now, paradoxically, even though there's a real threat there, it's actually calm along the border. People are coping with the situation. There's, of course, a strong psychological pressure because life is completely different now. In some parts of the borderland areas, the Taliban were not seen. The first time people there saw the Taliban was actually last summer, because in the 1990s, when the Taliban were ruling, 85 or 90% of Afghanistan, those borderland areas were under the control of the Northern Alliance. Right now, the Taliban are in full control, but the Taliban who are in charge of the borderland districts, they are local Taliban, quote unquote. They are from Badakhshan, so they are known by the people, and they also know the people and the coexistence between the communities there. So that's why it's relatively calm, even though, of course, there's a strong psychological pressure because, women cannot go out without being chaperoned. They have to be covered, which is new in some villages. And I want to, of course, nuance what I'm saying, because the western part of the border, if you go around Kunduz, of course, it's the situation is much different there. We saw a horrible attack recently, but the Kunduz area has always been more unstable than the eastern part of the border with Tajikistan. So just wanted to give you a general overview of what's going on along the border. Now, when it comes down to relations between the Taliban and Tajikistan, this position of Tajikistan has not been well welcomed. I want to say by the Taliban. There have been verbal and physical signs of threats by the Taliban. in the border areas particularly. So Samuel was mentioning the joint military drills taking place in Tajikistan. Those military drills have increased since last summer, so they're not new. There's always been military exercises along that border, but since last summer, they are more numerous, more recurrent, and also bigger in terms of the troops that are involved in those military drills. So that's on the Tajikistan part of the border. Now, on the Afghanistan part of the border, I wanted to show this short video. I don't know if it's gonna be played. There, the Taliban have put together a suicide battalion. So a battalion of people willing to kill themselves for the Taliban cause. It's called the Lashkar-e Mansour. Maybe some of our audience members have heard of this suicide battalion. They're now in 3 provinces of Afghanistan. So Takhar, Badakhshan, and also in Balkh. That's new as of yesterday. So the Taliban yesterday announced that they put together this suicide battalion in another province. So now we have like 3 major places where the suicide battalion is in place. But this is all about deterrence, right? This is a way to show off forces and to show Tajikistan that they have forces at the border, and that they really do not like Tajikistan anti-Taliban rhetoric. So that has been going on, this sort of like verbal and military signs of deterrence and threats by the Taliban and by Tajikistan. This has been going on in September, late August and September, but ever since Russia weighed in and tried to temper the two sides, it's been calmer. There has been less verbal signs of threat. So to try and conclude, I just like Samuel, I wanted to say that I don't want to predict the future, and I don't think it's very productive to try and speculate. But it's important to say that no one is interested in an open war. No one is interested in actually using weapons and being at war. Tajikistan and the Taliban are going to use diplomatic canals, and these are going to be prioritized because of the common interests that I mentioned in the first part. Because cross-border trade is extremely important, especially when it comes down to electricity, like I said, and also because there's a security threat that needs to be curbed. So Tajikistan is going to have to cooperate at some point. That being said, if the border is attacked, and if the border is crossed by terrorist groups, by armed groups, one thing we know, even though we don't know if it's going to happen, one thing we know is that many actors will react, many actors will weigh in, which leads me to the conclusion, in which I want to sort of zoom out to try to understand the region in a larger definition, which means looking at other actors. So like I said, if the border is crossed, we'll have the SCO, the OSC. I'm having a hard time with acronyms, but the Shanghai Cooperation. We're going to have the security, the OCST. Sorry, those treaties are going to be invoked, and also Russia and China are not far. Their troops are not far. It's in the case of China, the Wuhan corridor is closely monitored, and anyone who's going to cross in this area of the borderlands it's not going to escape Chinese control. So Central Asia, Russia, China, everyone is concerned about this border, but they're also extremely well prepared to react should anyone cross illegally. And my last sentence will be about this broad connectivity picture that Samuel and I were talking about, and this potential for connectivity that Central Asian countries want to see extended. This project of connecting the region is extremely reliant on Afghanistan's stability. And the question is, who is going to ensure that stability? That remains to be seen. So I'm going to stop here. And thank you so much for listening.
Many thanks, Mélanie, for this amazing presentation. We have also a great number of questions for both of you. And so let's move to the Q&A session. First of all, we have quite a wide question, a broad question for Sam about what you mentioned about Afghanistan being a threat or an opportunity for Russia. What about a threat or opportunity for both Russia and China? Because obviously we do have a European perspective, and we would see Russia and China using Afghanistan as an opportunity, certainly to fill a Western strategic void. What is your take on this, please? And do you think that this belongs to what the European would see, or perhaps Western countries would see as what we call the logic of blocks, like we used to see it at the time of the Cold War? So could we have your take on that first, Sam, please? And then we will move to more precise, specific questions for both of you. Many thanks.
Right, yeah, that's an excellent question. And thank you for forwarding it over here. I would say is that obviously it is a threat to Russia simply because of the spillover of extremism from Central Asia. But it's important to keep in mind that the counterterrorism discourse that Russia advances, it's kind of got a double edge to it. On the one hand, obviously, it is legitimately concerned about instability, but on the other hand, they have a tendency to inflate the number of ISIS fighters. For example, some unofficial estimates are showing 2,000 when the US was saying a few hundred. Other estimates have run as high as 5,000, 7,000 when the Western estimates were under 1,000. So the Russians have a tendency to politicize and exaggerate the threat for the precise reason because they have framed Syria in the context of it being preemptive war. Yeah. Basically, we have to fight ISIS in that territory before we fight them at home. And they need to kind of keep creating this magnified ISIS threat or Islamic extremist threat from their border region and from the far abroad to sustain those narratives. So I think it's a domestic political opportunity for Putin also, kind of focusing and zeroing in on the terrorism issues here, as well as a threat to Russia's security. So that's how I see the counterterrorism dimension. Moving outside of the pure CT dimension and looking more broadly at the situation in Afghanistan, obviously, one of the greatest spillover effects is that countries across the world, and even when I was, for example, engaging with some intellectuals and some commentators and U.S. allies and partners in the Gulf, like the UAE or Saudi Arabia, their views are that the West has abdicated leadership. It abandoned Ashraf Ghani, and it had no game plan to follow it. So we need to strengthen our embrace of a multipolar world order, and that means strengthening relationships with Russia and China. So this kind of inchoate nature of the American withdrawal and the questions that are being raised about American leadership by partners both within the Indo-Pacific region and also further afield, like in the Middle East, is a status advantage. The convening of talks and showing that Russia is a major diplomatic arbiter is also another advantage that bolsters and boosts Russia's status and prestige as a potential negotiator, as a potential alternative diplomatic counterweight to the West, especially where the West is disengaged. And similar things apply towards China too, because if there's a movement towards a multipolar world order, China is going to be the even bigger beneficiary of that move than Russia has, because it has a lot more to offer. And China is pursuing very similar tactics in terms of the chairing of talks. And that's something that goes back a long time. Like even when the Trump Taliban negotiations collapsed at Camp David in 9/11, 2019, what happened within 2 weeks of that? The Russians and the Chinese both hosted talks with the Taliban and Inter-Afghan dialogue. I suspect that trend will keep repeating itself again and again moving forward. Russia and Iran are hosting talks this month. I'm sure that China, before long, will be having a format talk in Tianjin, perhaps, like what we're seeing right now. So that's that is a major status boost. But in terms of the material advantages, that's where it gets a little bit iffier, obviously because of sanctions, obviously because of asset freezes. The Chinese, even as early as 2000, were the lone great power international voice and want to lift UN sanctions on the Taliban and allow investments to come in. So the Chinese are probably going to be more eager than anyone to get in, but they have limited prospects, as do the Russians. So I think it's more of an opportunity from the status and global power projection standpoint, not from the material standpoint. And it's a And for Russia in particular, I think because China's muzzled the discourse so much on the East Turkestan Islamic movement, it won't have the same effect. The narratives about CT are both reflect legitimate threats as well as Putin's own regime security interests and own desire to rally people around an external other.
Thank you very much, guys, for both your fascinating presentations that were very congruent, combining both the local, regional, and the more like global scales. We have a second batch of questions for you, Mélanie and Sam. Mélanie, about the recent trip of the Tajik president to Paris. So I read the question: why came Emmanuel Rahman in Europe, and what did he finally? So we understand this visit as a fear and concern over Russia's security commitment toward Tajikistan. And is that clear, Mélanie?
Sorry, yeah, please go ahead. Should I answer now, or did you want to read another question?
No, and like for someone that we keep on specifically on Tajikistan. And so the second question is for you, Mélanie. How efficiently is the entire Tajik border with Afghanistan monitored? And for you, Samuel, could you explain why you think Russia will likely outsource terrorism responsibilities to Central Asian countries when we see how it reinforced the 201st military base in Tajikistan for the past 2 months? It doesn't seem that Russia is willing to completely outsource the counter-terrorist component. Mm. So basically, will Central Asian countries be able to implement counter-terrorism operation and policy on behalf of Russia against the Taliban, if any, of course? Thank you very much, guys.
Okay, so I'll start with the recent trip of the president of Tajikistan to Europe. It's actually sort of a coincidence that he was visiting Europe right after the Taliban took over. At least the visit in France was planned. It's been a few years now that there's an exhibition that was put together in Paris about Tajikistan's archaeological objects. So they decided to open the exhibition very recently. So there's this one coincidence of having President Rahman here for this event. But now, what does that mean? To have him talk to the French president. For me, it was just a way for Tajikistan to be in the spotlight, given what's going on in Afghanistan. But nothing really came out of this meeting with the French president. A lot of, they declared that they were committed to cooperating on security issues, and like a lot of diplomatic sort of jibber jabber, there's not a lot of content that came out of this visit. It was a way for Tajikistan to remember, Western partners, that Tajikistan was at the forefront of security issues going on in Afghanistan. So just a way to, remind the French president, of his concerns. But that's my opinion. I don't think a lot came out. Also, when you look at the bilateral relation between France and Tajikistan, it's not, I mean, it's a deep cooperation, but it's not a lot is going on. It's a lot about, cultural cooperation, trying to have Tajikistani citizens learn French, all these like sort of small soft power initiatives, but it's not a military cooperation at all, and I don't think it's going to get back to that. So for me, it doesn't mean a lot to have him, to have President Rahman visit France. How efficiently is the border militarized and monitored? It's very uneven because of the geography and the topography of the borderland areas. The eastern part of the border is is located in high altitude, so it's not easy to monitor. The border is a river as well, so it's sort of easy and not really easy to monitor because it's a river, so it's easy to patrol all along the river. And when you go to the border and when you travel along the border, you always see Tajikistani soldiers sort of patrolling and walking all along the border. But they're not numerous. They're always there, but there's not a lot of them, and they're more patrolling the western part of the border. The eastern part is not super militarized. The western part is much more militarized because it's flatter. It's not in high altitude, so it's flat. It's sort of the desert land, so it's easier to monitor. So all the military drills, most of them, not all of them, but the majority of them are taking place on this side of the border where it's flat and easy to monitor. And this part of the border is very much militarized. Now the eastern part is much harder to monitor, and that's also the reason why we have China, who China has deployed. It has deployed some, I think, police military, not troops per se, but there's a base now, and we know about it. Very recently, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has provided very thorough information about this base. And they're monitoring the eastern part of the border precisely because Tajikistan is lacking control on this part of the border. So all in all, the monitoring and the militarization of the border is very uneven. And the Russians are mostly on the western side of the border.
Thank you, Mélanie.
Yeah, back. Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you, Mélanie. That was a great answer on that. So with respect to the outsourcing of terrorism responsibilities in the 201st military base and that issue, what I would say is that obviously the Russians do not want to be directly involved or even be seen to be directly involved in a military sense in Afghanistan. So that's why I think it's very unlikely that Russia is going to be carrying out airstrikes on Afghan territory, even for anti-narcotics purposes, outside of the confines of an organization like the SCO or bilaterally with another country. And there doesn't seem to be the inclination on the Russian side to either work with the United States or like they did in the past, or get China roped into that. So when I say if there's going to be restraint and they say there's going to be a need to outsource, it would probably be the military side of things. I think that a good evidence of that would be in August of 2019, there was a cross-border terrorism raid on the Tajik-Afghan border that entered Afghan soil. And there was a lot of speculation at the time that the Russians were involved. The Russians denied it and effectively created the impression in their media outlets that the Tajiks were involved in that, even though the Tajiks were also unwilling to take credit. So that precedent suggests that Russia is probably going to be unwilling to engage in military operations. It would probably pass the buck over. And I think that reflects something more broad that we're seeing about Russian foreign policy. Look at the way the Russians, for example, were so reticent to defend their treaty ally Armenia during the fall 2020 war in Nagorno-Karabakh. There's this discourse of restraint in the post-Soviet space towards overextended alliance commitments that even some Russian commentators like Fyodor Lukyanov and others are starting to tap into and starting to seize onto. There isn't that appetite for revanchism and for kind of engaging so overwhelmingly on the behalf of countries in the post-Soviet space and fighting their problems for them, like we saw in Ukraine back in 2014, 2015. And that reflects a public opinion shift inside Russia, which was strongly reflected in both the Duma election campaigns and in Vladimir Putin's 2018 presidential election campaign about socioeconomic issues, about issues like healthcare, unemployment, pension reform, things like this. So there is a need for military restraint, and that is extending towards the post-Soviet space. That's why I don't feel that Russia is going to be that involved. That obviously does not preclude drills. That obviously does not preclude providing the Central Asian countries in a remote capacity with the defense infrastructure that they're going to need. But if Tajikistan, for example, is to back the National Resistance Front unilaterally and find itself in a major cross-border tussle with the Taliban, that's purely a Tajik-Afghan issue and not a Taliban-Russian issue, the Russians are probably not going to get into that. Even when there were those threat of that escalation happening around September 30th, 1st of October, the Russian statements were all just the Tajiks and the Taliban need to talk and work this out. So they're not going to get involved in those kind of local disputes. they'll be happy to see Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan take the lead in promoting Central Asian solutions to crises. And with respect to Turkmenistan too, like Mullah Baradar meeting with Turkmen officials in Ashgabat after a period of time in which there were tensions, with the Taliban about the safety of Tapi and the death of border security guards, etc. The Russians were not getting involved in those sorts of disputes. Obviously, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan are not treaty allies of Russia, whereas Tajikistan is. But in all three cases, the Russians were disengaged and the Russians were cautious. And that's why I don't think the Russians are going to get involved in a military sense or fight Central Asia's battles for them. They will only fortify the Central Asian countries defensively, expand their hegemony and military infrastructure there as a deterrent to America stepping in and using their bases, which is a big red line, or China getting too involved in their regional near abroad, and then on local issues, let local actors fight their own battles out. That's kind of how I see it, and that's why I'm making that prediction at the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Mélanie. Thank you, Sam. We have another batch of 3 questions about like some comparison with Russia's policy toward Afghanistan and Russia's policy in the greater Middle East. So maybe the first question for more specifically for Mélanie. Russia has gained a sizable experience in dealing with refugees and providing humanitarian aid to conflict-affected population in the context of the Syrian civil war. As so far, Moscow offered its support in this field to Central Asian countries to help them dealing with the situation with refugees from Afghanistan. So this was the first question for Mélanie. And it was a question for Samuel, maybe. Over the past few years, Russia and Turkey have been increasingly interacting in various conflicts in Libya, in Syria, and in Karabakh. Do you think, given Turkish involvement in the Afghan crisis, do you think that we can accept such kind of cooperation between Moscow and Ankara on Afghanistan? And the third question, to what extent Russian involvement into the Afghan crisis can be understood as a part of a wider Russian strategy towards the Middle East? Good luck, Samuel, for this question.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think Samuel has actually a better answer than mine when talking about Russia's support to Central Asian countries. Actually, I don't think Russia's line on refugees is to sort of support an influx of refugees. I think Russia is trying to Russia has convinced Central Asian countries not to open their arms to refugees, and that's why the Central Asian borders are closed. Not Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are not willing to have refugees. They're not willing to host anyone. We know that some Afghans have been pushed back at this, I think it was at the border with Turkmenistan. And that's definitely along Russia's interest not to have refugees coming in. So now when we talk about the humanitarian support, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan's humanitarian aid was done on behalf of themselves, not on behalf of Russia. Now I don't know to what extent Russia is actually supporting these initiatives. I think Samuel can give a better answer to that.
Thanks, Mel.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so with respect to the question of Russia and Turkey, and whether they can apply that cooperation that we've been seeing elsewhere to the Afghan theater, I think that there's definitely a lot that the Russians would have in common with Turkey with regards to this. Both Russia and Turkey have pursued a broadly similar policy towards the Taliban since the takeover on August the 15th. They have pursued largely one of engagement without recognition of the Taliban, though I think Turkey has been even more cautious to some degree than the Russians have been about actually outright engagement. But the Turks have also hosted summits, like in 2018, February, there was one in Istanbul that was very similar to what we're seeing with the Moscow format talks. So these countries seem to be cooperating in quite close tandem. And I would say that inside Russia, there is naturally a suspicion of Turkey's involvement in Central Asia. So when I was there, for example, in 2017, I met with the MIGIMO experts and diplomats and people who worked on Turkey, and I was asking them, what do you see about Turkey Council involvement, their involvement in Afghanistan, by extension, what it might lead to their involvement with Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan. And their view is that Turkey is a regional power that wants to be a great power, and it could even be like a potential conduit for NATO expansion in these areas and facilitating Western interests. So there's a lot of skepticism. So if Turkey just sticks with inter-Afghan dialogue and focus on engaging with the Taliban, then the Russians and the Turks might be able to find common ground. There's no reason why I think when the extended troika, once Iran and India are in, Turkey would be the next frontier for expanding Russian diplomatic initiatives on Afghanistan. And it could be another area where they can find cooperation, even as they disagree in Syria and Libya, and uneasily coexist in the South Caucasus. But if Turkey were to get more assertive in Central Asia and start dealing with Central Asian security in some way, which I think is a more remote scenario, though training cannot be ruled out, they've been doing that as far-flung as Somalia, so training is something that the Turks are dabbling in, then we could start to see some of the prickly relationships, some of the skepticism that I mentioned earlier. And that skepticism I saw from my own visits in 2017, but looking at discourse, that dates back to the 1990s and was especially acute when Russia was very insecure about its great power status and feeling a lot more like a regional power in decline during the 1990s. So that's why I think that, it'll be, there are scope for cooperation, but it won't necessarily extend to the Central Asian area. It would just be about engaging with the Taliban. And could you just remind me very briefly about the last part of that question? Because I heard it in parts, but then there was noise outside. I missed a bit. What was the second part?
Sure, Samuel. The last question was,
like a dog barking or something outside.
No, you're fine. The last question was about how is it possible to understand Russia's involvement into the Afghan crisis as a part of Russia's greater Middle East strategy.
So Russian diplomatic involvement in crises is part of their great power assertiveness.
Exactly, yeah.
So yes, definitely Russia has tried to recreate the narrative of it being a global power, that concept of Dershavnost, and that really is something that came out of domestic intellectual debates about Russia's role and Russia's future in the world during the 1990s. So on the one hand, you had Soviet-era hands like Karol Brutens and Vadim Volsky from the Latin American Institute, the president of that, who worked on issues of the Third World, are basically saying that Russia should cut off these kind of dependency relationships with countries in the global South, like whether it be Mengistu's Ethiopia, those kind of patron-client relationships and those kind of unnecessary forays into diplomacy serve very little purpose. But there were also, on the flip side of that, there were conservative intellectual voices, namely Primakov, but also people like Andrei Bagranian and Karaganov and others who vacillated back and forth on this, who were more inclined to, over time, support Russian greatness and Russian reassertiveness and Russian involvement. And ultimately, by the end of the 1990s, it appeared as if those more internationalist-minded voices beat the voices of restraint out. And that's been carrying forward. And those internationalists have also ensconced themselves and become key advisors to Putin and become an extension of his inner circle. And there are maybe different priorities within the Russian Ministry of Defense and Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs of what to do. And we're seeing that also play out in Afghanistan by some of the diverse reactions that I mentioned. But all of them are pretty much united on this idea that Russia should remain a more active global player. And it's interesting that a lot of the debates in Russia about restraint are happening with regards to backing post-Soviet clients like Armenia and Central Asia, but not necessarily about their lower cost, but highly status-effective global role. So this status-effective global role and the status signaling on the world stage and its embrace of a multipolar world order is important, I think, for Putin's own domestic coalition to be kept in line and to rally public support around Russia as a great power. Their signature achievements of the past decade, if you look at opinion polls, are military modernization and the reassertion of Russia as a great power. And that's especially important as the Russian economy remains stagnant. So this is, I think, not just a thing about Russian ambition, but it's actually an existential issue, I think, too, this projection of diplomatic power for Putin's own stability and legacy at home. And that's why I see it really continuing in the context of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is just the latest theater where they will try to be a dialogue facilitator and not necessarily an arbiter but if they achieve any notable successes, like they've done with Syria and Central-African Republic, they will sell some kind of Afghan model of diplomatic reconciliation as far flung as sub-Saharan Africa or wherever there's a fragile state. So it's something to watch from many different standpoints, both domestic and international.
Thanks.
Many thanks, both of you. So 2 more questions for Mélanie and 1 for Sam. The 2 first questions for Mélanie. What about the cohesion of the Taliban regarding the cooperation with Russia? That's the first one. In the second one, Mélanie, would be, is there a possibility that Tajikistan will support the Afghan resistance militarily?
Yeah, and maybe I ask the question to Sam now. It's about, is there any evidences of presence of Prigozhin activities or the Wagner group in Afghanistan so far? Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. So regarding the cohesion within the Taliban and the cooperation with Russia, I think, in general, the Taliban are not a homogeneous group, right? You have the branch of those very, like to draw a very general picture, you have those who are sort of willing to cooperate with foreign governments and those who are more like radical and more skeptical about it. So to be honest, I am not really sure if they're all in line with this cooperation with Russia. So I won't be able to give you a great answer about that. But I think definitely, they're not necessarily all behind this cooperation. But I don't know much about this. And is Tajikistan willing to? I think the second question was about like Tajikistan willing to support militarily the Afghan resistance. Well, is there a possibility? That's the question. Of course it's likely because they already support them rhetorically, and also they are giving them space to talk, which is very important because it's embodied by this person that I mentioned, Ambassador Ahbar. So now when it comes down to military support, first it's possible, but if that happens, it won't be a massive military support because Russia is supporting Tajikistan militarily. So that would mean that Russia would be behind the support of the resistance. So right now we have no confirmation of such a military support. If it's of course everything's possible, but as of right now we have no confirmation of that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just a brief elaboration on Melanie's points in the respect of the first question with regards to members of the Taliban who have connections towards Russia. It does seem as if the relationships that Russia forged with the Taliban over the past 15 years, and especially over the past 4 to 5, have been often with people who are not really seen on the front lines. Like, for example, Stanekzai. Stanekzai was a regular at the Moscow format talks. He released a statement right when the bounty issue was becoming a very heated one, and he came out and basically defended Russia's involvement in Afghanistan against those accusations. And that was seen as a positive thing within Russia. There have not been the degree of engagements, obviously, with Mullah Akhund or Mullah Baradar to the same extent as to people like him. And when I was in Moscow, they would always talk about this notion of good Taliban or bad Taliban or moderate or extremist, or they would tend to create like a binary to try to classify people and stuff like this. And it was not really any of the current names that were taking power were people that they were considering as prospective partners. I think that also extends, of course, to even more so, they're concerned about Sirajud Nakhani and the Nakhani network's influence. If you read Russian commentaries, that's quite significant. So I think that they are probably underwhelmed and disappointed by some of the people who are empowered within the current coalition. And that might reflect some of the rhetorical changes that we've seen in Russia's attitude towards the Taliban since the beginning of September to mid-October now, and why they've been a little more erring on the pessimistic side. in terms of prospects of recognition, dragging their feet also on cooperation. So that's just what, again, but there's very little known about how all these factional dynamics work. So this is all circumstantial, but it's interesting. And then with respect to the Wagner group, with respect to Prigozhin and the question that I believe was coming forward, it was interesting to see that Maxim Shugalay, right, who was a senior Russian political technologist and operative / former Duma candidate, who was imprisoned in Libya and was working at Prigozhin's behest in various African countries, Madagascar, Central African Republic, arrived in Kabul 2 days before the takeover the Kabul airport attack, right? The terrorist attack that happened over there. So he was there. He was there officially doing at his usual mission of doing ethnographic and sociological research, though he has not really produced a single publication. He's got no citations in the WebEx of the Russian academic database. It all seems to be very nebulous. But there, we definitely see him meeting with Zabiul Mujahid, who had after that also was praising Russia's prospective potential to be a partner for the Taliban. But is that really just political technologists and communication support for the Taliban, kind of helping them fine-tune their narratives at Prigozhin's behest, or is it a sign of something much bigger? I don't think that Russia will engage the Wagner group here, either in a deniable fashion, like as it often is in Africa, or in a fashion that's at risk of being exposed, because as deniable as they try to be, the liberal Russian media outlets like Novaya Gazeta and investigative journalists inevitably shed light on these things to a domestic audience. We've seen that happen in Libya. We've seen that happen in Central African Republic when Russian nationals are killed, and they wouldn't want to take that risk in Afghanistan. So I think that, again, the trend of indirect intervention, fortifying, and outsourcing is what's going to happen there. And we're not going to see a deniable intervention of any sort in Afghanistan, though Wagner and people might be involved in political interference and political consulting purposes. That's a business venture that the Russian state might, if they don't approve of, might turn a blind eye to. So we should watch out for that too, particularly if, as the Taliban try to consolidate control over non-Pashtun ethnic groups, maybe they'll probably need some communications assistance to help their narratives along.
So many thanks, both of you. Perhaps a last question, a kind of a conclusive remark. You both mentioned, and Mélanie in particular, the fact that border countries would recognize or not recognize the Taliban regime and Taliban government. Do you think, when you see the future, would you say that the strategy toward Afghanistan would be isolate or engage? Perhaps using what kind of leverage can bordering countries and perhaps more greater power use on the Taliban government? Should they try to pressure the Taliban government using the dependence on energy that Mélanie mentioned, and then perhaps let civil society have a take, or engage more or differently? Because some you mentioned in particular the specific engagement of Russia using a cross-ethnic engagement, something lacking from the perspective of Western countries, perhaps. Okay, many thanks for your take on this last question. Perhaps
and just,
okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, Maud. Yeah.
Just as a complementary question for that last group of remarks and questions, what will be the reaction of the West if relations between the Taliban and Russia would develop?
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Maud, for this very interesting question. I think, like I mentioned, so we have in Central Asia, when we talk about border countries, we have Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan have been engaged with the Taliban very publicly, and they have not I want to say formally recognized the Taliban, but they've met with Taliban officials, and they're willing to support them all in all. So they're definitely engaging with them now. Tajikistan is not engaged with the Taliban, and like I said, and like you said, I think the key issue there will be the connectivity issue and the energy issue, because and it's what's interesting is that Tajikistan has not cut off electricity, and to me it's it signifies a lot. It means that, you know, they'll continue to provide electricity up until, you know, they're going to say, you know, to the Taliban, now you owe us some money, so give us some money, or it will just, you know, cut down electricity, and the population won't have electricity, and then the population will not be satisfied with that, and, you know, that is going to be a huge thorn in the side for the Taliban. So for me, the main leverage is not necessarily really supporting the resistance. I think the resistance is right now within Afghanistan is not functioning well, so that's not the leverage for Tajikistan. The leverage is definitely on paying off the debt for, you know, electricity support. The debt right now, I mean, I don't know exactly how high the debt is, but the electricity provision is worth, from Tajikistan to Afghanistan, it's worth $45 million every year. So, you know, there's a lot of money to pay, and the Taliban will need to deliver on that. So for me, that's the main leverage in engaging with the Taliban. But they have not, I mean, the Tajikistani authorities have not really said anything about that clearly. And, you know, it's something to look at definitely in the future.
The floor is Sam's now.
Yeah, so sorry, what will you discuss here?
Yes, Samuel, could you elaborate perhaps on the idea of isolate or engage, or the different type of engagements that you mentioned, or the specificity of the Russian engagement in Afghanistan in comparison with the engagement of other actors? Okay,
yeah, so I think that basically you can kind of distribute the international community's response to the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan to several broad categories. You have obviously the United States, Britain, and the European Union flat out ruling out any kind of recognition anytime soon. Then you have the India, which was kind of carving out a balance between this, and I guess Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and some Gulf monarchies were also following a similar path, where they were not categorically ruling it out, but then also were not making any moves. They were kind of more in the role of a spectator. And then you have varying degrees of engagement with the Taliban, engagement without recognition. So that's really where Russia, Iran, China, Qatar, Turkey, and of course Pakistan all kind of lie in that spectrum to varying degrees. So Russia's engagement is really comparable to a lot like what those other 6 countries are doing. It's maybe a little less more pessimistic to some regards about the security implications because of their proximity and because it's more of a real threat than what China is saying. But they're broadly in support of things like unfreezing assets being held by the Taliban, the removal of sanctions. They're broadly supportive of treating the Taliban as the de facto governing authority, even though they still need to be more politically inclusive to get the terrorist designation removed and to get any kind of progress towards actual formal recognition. So the Russians are probably aligning more with the consensus of non-Western powers on this issue. There's nothing really that exceptional about their trajectory, though the terrorism designation is a caveat that makes recognition slightly harder than, let's say, it would be for the Chinese or for the Pakistanis if they ever wanted to make that move. But Pakistan, but every country has got a limiting factor. I mean, Russia's got the terrorism issue. China obviously has got the East Turkestan Islamic movement issue. Pakistan's got the perception issue that doesn't want to be seen as too closely aligned in sponsoring the Taliban, which is why Imran Khan makes it very clear that Pakistan will not recognize the Taliban unless some of its non-Western partners follow suit. So it will probably not be the first. It will be maybe the second or the third. The Iranians have domestic disputes that are very serious between the conservative hardliners and the reformist, more moderate voices about the Taliban, whether it's a threat, whether it's an opportunity or triumph of anti-Americanism. Even the Iranian proxies are disagreed as to whether the Taliban takeover is a good thing or whether it's just part of America's desire to sow chaos and discord in Central and South Asia. So they're divided. Turkey and Qatar obviously have the U.S. alignment, in Turkey's case, the NATO connection that makes limits on how far they can defy American policy. So every country has a limitation and constraint. Russia is the terrorism designation, but everybody else has too. So that's why I think that their pattern of recognition is going to be much more similar in trajectory to what we see those other five non-Western powers doing than different or unique. They're not going to carve out an exceptional course here.
Great. Many thanks, Sam. Unfortunately, this discussion is coming to an end, and this was thanks to both of you, Mélanie and Samuel, a huge event with almost 200 attendees today. So let me remind you that this event is recorded, so you will be able to share it and to find it on thanks to an IRSEM YouTube link. Thank you so much, Samuel, for taking the time for preparing this particular presentation in depth. Between one for the Wall Street Journal, perhaps one for the Washington Post, I can imagine, and obviously
one more for Foreign Affairs, maybe. So thank you, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, and many thanks to you, Mélanie, again for taking the time for being with us. So let me tell you that this is not completely over, because tomorrow afternoon, this seminar will have a second part with our colleague Aurélie Billard, introducing a different perspective on state and law in Afghanistan and the failure, understanding the reason why the failure of NATO in Afghanistan. And the two speakers will be Gilles Daronsoro and Adam Basco, who will both present different views on from the point of view of Afghan population in particular. So many thanks for being with us. And
well, of course, Mel and Samuel, if you want to attend tomorrow event, you're more than welcome. Yeah.
Of course.
We would be honored. So, but thanks again for today's presentation. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for organizing it, and honored to be to be talking with Samuel. It's a great honor.
Thank you so much. It was a great honor and great to be speaking with Mélanie and IRSEM. And hopefully, if I can make it tomorrow, I'll try to tune in too. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mélanie.
Bye.
Bye-bye.